Not at the studio with Kitchen Theory today. We have Professor Barry Smith from the Centre for the Study of the Senses in London. I've had the privilege of knowing Barry for several years now, being acquainted with his work, and I have to say it's had a huge impact on what inspired our perspective on gastronomy with Kitchen Theory and taking a real appreciation of the senses into consideration when designing dining experiences. Barry has worked with some incredible chefs from all across the world, and I am super excited to have him here on the show today, where we'll be discussing the senses, obviously, the importance of our sense of smell, which I know is a key area of interest in Barry's research, as well as looking at multisensory dining experiences and what this may mean going into the future. Barry, thank you ever so much for joining us on the podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. For those that maybe aren't as well acquainted as I am with your work, give me a bit of an idea of what it is that, what kind of research you guys do at the Centre for the Study of the Senses.
So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very glad to talk to you. So at the Centre for the Study of the Senses, we got together a team of philosophers, psychologists, and neuroscientists to investigate the way our senses work and the way they interact. And we were motivated by two thoughts, really. One, that we have many more than 5 senses, and that our senses don't work separately. They're constantly interacting to affect one another's workings. So as we started to look at different kinds of sensory interactions, taste, smell, and flavor in my case, and other people looking at sight and touch and hearing and sight, we opened 2 labs, which is an unusual thing to do in an Institute of Philosophy, which I direct at the University of London, but it became very obvious that we were attracting interest from perfumers, filmmakers, and especially from people in the food and drink industry who were a little bit behind you, Joseph, but trying to see that the idea of multisensory experience was actually going to have a huge impact on the way they thought about what they were doing and how they could deliver it.
And this sounds like it was all really kind of multidisciplinary in the way that it came about. But was that the initial intention? Did you know that there would be so many different disciplines that would be able to come together in this meaningful way?
I think so. I mean, I had been writing in an amateur way for the press about wine, and there I was prosing on about how we enjoyed the taste of wine, some of the attractions of it, some of the qualities of it. And then I thought, I better find out how taste actually works. So I talked to friends in psychology and neuroscience, and actually Professor Charles Spence, who you know very well and who you work with at Kitchen Theory, Charles and I sat down in a cafe in Paris for a very long time and started to talk about all the things that were involved in our taste or experience of food. It wasn't just taste, it was touch, taste, smell. It could be impacted by the sounds around us, by the colors of things that we were eating or eating off. And I suddenly realized, we have to think again, and we'll need many people to look at the senses. And philosophers had for a long time thought of, the classic 5. So seeing, hearing, touch, taste, and smell, that's it. And then, of course, neuroscientists will say, we have at least 22 or 33 senses. And I thought, gosh, okay, we will need a lot of people in this inquiry if we're going to figure out.
And what would some of those senses include? So what are the other senses that we maybe take for granted?
Yeah, I mean, one to think of immediately is proprioception. If people right now were to close their eyes, they would know where their limbs are without either looking or feeling them. They can tell from the inside.
Right, okay.
And your sense of balance, which is terribly important. If people have problems with their sense of balance, the world seems very strange. So your sense of balance it involves proprioception. It involves knowing where your body is, but it also involves the little ear canals we have, the vestibular system that tell us whether we're tilting backwards or going sideways or up or down in a lift. And they work along with vision to give you stability and balance. But most importantly for you and me, I think, are the fact that many of the things that we think of as a single sense actually can be broken down into many senses. So we have touch is It's pain, it's temperature, it's the feel of something, it's the sensations it gives to you. It can be the tingling of spice, it can be the cooling sensation in the mouth. So once you realize that it's not a single sense, it's in fact hovering across 5 or 6 different systems, then we begin to see what they are and how they interact.
And you see, for me, it was these ideas that really inspired me when we first met. So it was 2011, and it was a talk on multisensory gastronomy that it was yourself and Professor Spence who were delivering it at Senate House. I think it was Rachel Edwards who had organized that talk. And I remember at one point, I think you asked how many chefs were in the room. I think I was the only hand that kind of went up. And I did find it extraordinary that as chefs, the way we're trained, the way as human beings, we kind of take so much about flavor for granted. And we really do focus in on how things taste. And I think even the words taste and flavor, a lot of people find them really hard to kind of define what the difference is between them. But I think having an understanding of not only designing dishes, but dining experiences, taking all the senses into consideration, really does allow chefs to, have a stronger narrative, to really take people on that journey and to transport them. And I think these are all elements that you have worked on over the years, working with chefs, I guess, like Heston Blumenthal at the Fat Duck. What kind of projects or what kind of ideas were you looking at when you've worked with chefs like that in the past?
We were looking at all the things that could be in the palette, as it were, of materials they could use. So I remember going to interview Heston for a radio program very early on. And the program was for a series on the mysteries of the brain. And I remember thinking it would be interesting to talk to Heston, but it may be a little peripheral because, we would be talking about senses of touch and smell and taste. And when we met, he said, the most important thing about eating is not the eyes, it's not the nose, it's not the mouth, it's the brain. Because the brain is what is putting together all the information you're getting from your senses at a moment and trying to sum up what's going on out there, both what is it I'm in touch with and what's happening to me. And that's the thing that I thought he beautifully encapsulated, was the idea that our senses tell us about the things around us. Our eyes and ears are attuned to what we're looking at and what we're listening to. But our other senses are telling us about us. How are things with me? How am I doing? And the way in which when you're giving somebody a meal, chefs, I love working with chefs because chefs are incredibly hardworking, incredibly inventive, but also incredibly precise. They have something of the scientist and the artist about them. And I think that means that it's an inspiring place to work because they're aware of materials, they're aware of process and practice, but they are open to new ideas, new techniques, new inputs. And when you realize that, our chemical senses, our sense of smell and our sense of taste, these are the kind of gatekeepers about what we put inside ourselves and what we find acceptable. What are you prepared to ingest? What are you going to reject? So here's a sort of crucial boundary between the inner and the outer, which we police very carefully. And chefs have to offer something which is novel, exciting, interesting, more than just hyper-pleasing, fat, salt, and sugar. It's got to be something more interesting, more enjoyable. At the same time, it's complex. And how do people approach the complexity of what's being created and get the most out of it? And I think that's what interests me. People like yourself, people like Heston, they're creating dishes of enormous complexity. And the question is, how do we give people the means to unlock that complexity and to understand what's gone in there and to get enough out of it? And he and I were looking at things we might do in the restaurant, things we might do on the plate, how our ears could be involved, how sight could be involved as auxiliaries to help you break down and appreciate, what was there and delivered as delicious and worthy of your interest.
And I think it's such an important point what you mentioned about flavor being this construct of the mind rather than just a kind of sensory stimulus or sensation that we can enjoy in the moment. But for those who maybe aren't so familiar with how the senses work, what do we mean when we say kind of cross-modal perception? What does that mean when I'm in the context of eating? Why is it that my senses, or how are my senses working together?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing to notice is that, a huge part of what we call taste is in fact smell. Now, at the moment, sadly, this is something that more and more people are coming to understand, because with COVID-19 and the spread of the virus, a lot of people have had a sudden loss of smell, and they suddenly say, and they report it as, I can't taste anything. I can't taste anything in my coffee. None of the food has any flavor. And when I talk to them or when they email me, I will say, are you sure you've lost taste and it doesn't smell? Try putting a bit of salt on your tongue. Try putting a bit of sugar, a drop of lemon juice. Can you taste that? And they always come back and say, oh, yes, I can taste that. But that's all I can taste. And now they know how much of what they were enjoying as flavor is in fact due to smell. Our tongues.
So where would that make a difference? Let's say where like, what would the difference be? So I'm just kind of thinking, if I had two types of acid, right? Like a lemon and a lime.
Yeah.
What is the differentiator in taste there? And what's the differentiator that makes them so different?
Yes. I mean, I'm very interested in that question, because I think that's actually a harder question than we know. For the rest of us, there will be a difference in flavor that's due to smell. And you can get that because if you cut open a lemon and smell it, and you cut open a lime, very different. And that's going to play into how they taste. That's going to be the difference in flavor. But imagine that you're someone who grew up without a sense of smell, people born without an olfactory bulb, people who are congenitally anosmic, as we say, no sense of smell. Some of them are really quite discriminating and will appreciate the difference between a lemon and a lime. Now, that cannot be from smell. It might be the level of acidity. We know limes are slightly higher in acid. It can be also sweetness being due to differences in the timing. So, for example, when people have sweeteners in their coffee, you say, well, what would be the difference between aspartame, an artificial sweetener, and sugar? Because after all, we've only got sweet receptors, and we haven't got aspartame and sweet receptors. We've got, those. So the same substances are stimulating the same receptors, but the difference is timing. Turns out that aspartame has a slower onset and a longer offset. Sugar will have a slightly faster offset. So you will get this temporal difference. That's why people will sometimes say artificial sweeteners are a bit cloying. The taste seems to last longer, and indeed it does. So notice
that's down to the molecular structure of the type of sugar. Yeah. But is that also to do with your personal physiology, or will we all react to these things in the same way?
So your personal physiology will make a huge difference. I'm very interested in people who have been born without a sense of smell, who still do very good discrimination between tastes. And I think they're using taste and texture to distinguish fruits, to distinguish wines. And it will be easier for them to do if they've got many papillae on their tongue. So if they're so-called super tasters and they have densely packed papillae on the tongue, they will pick up more that's going on from taste and touch. For example, people who are super tasters won't need as much salt on their dishes, because how salty something is how many salt receptors are touched simultaneously by salt molecules, NaCl. And if you have very densely packed receptors, you only need a little. But if your receptors are far apart, you need to sprinkle further to get the same hit. And once you know that people live in different taste worlds, as you well know, it seems to me that chefs who create carefully balanced tasting menus might want to give people a tasting strip first. They might want to find out, well, how sensitive a taster are you? Because the food will be very different to you than your neighbor.
And what I find really fascinating about that is when I realized that such a high percentage of what we term as flavor, or what we term as taste, actually is flavor and is coming from our sense of smell. As a chef, you kind of think, well, maybe I should be rethinking how I design dishes, right? If so much of this is down to what people are smelling, well, then maybe there are kind of more innovative and interesting ways of maybe making more salient in people's minds those aromatic components, or making them more of a feature of the dish in some way. So how does our sense of smell, when it comes to a kind of congruent and enjoyment of food, people could say, well, some cheeses stink. I mean, they don't smell nice necessarily. When you open the fridge, you get that waft and it doesn't necessarily smell great. But once you're eating them, they're absolutely delicious. So how does that work?
How does that work? That works because you've got two routes by which odor molecules reach the receptors. So by breathing in and inhaling, you get the molecules going straight through the nose to the olfactory epithelium up here at the nasal cleft. The other way, of course, is when you've got molecules in your mouth. When you're chewing your food, you're releasing those little volatile molecules, and they make their way up to the nose, through the back of the throat, through the nasopharynx. Now, those two different routes, even though it might be the same molecules, can give rise to quite different experiences. And as you say, smelly cheese and époisse that's so ripe, it's almost running off the table. People think, oh, disgusting. Smells like a teenager's training shoe, I always think. But you put it in your mouth and it's really lovely. It's rather creamy and delightful. That's a mismatch between a smell from outside the nose when you're breathing in and a smell from odors in the mouth. Now, the opposite match would be where something disappoints you. And I always, my parade ground example is coffee. The smell of freshly ground coffee is wonderful. Just smelling any average brewed coffee, the odor is intoxicating. But aren't you always a little disappointed when you get it in your mouth? It never really has the same hit. And that's for two reasons. One, that the molecules are traveling from the mouth to the nose, different route, and a different neurological response to them. The other is that saliva will strip off about 300 of the 800 volatiles, meaning you'll never get the same hit. So this is why I think drink your coffee in the presence of the coffee aroma and smell. And, you know, people say wake up and smell the coffee. They don't say wake up and taste it. If you put a nose peg on and you just taste the coffee, it's hot water with a bitter taste. So coffee is all about aroma. So you're right. I think chefs can think about how to maximize aroma, but they've got to be very careful experimenting between what are the aromas like when they're in the mouth and what are they like outside.
And so, well, that kind of begs an interesting question then, because if I think about how a lot of coffee is served in your casual diners or sandwich shops, that you tend to have them with a cap on.
Terrible idea. Terrible idea.
So surely that's asking for some kind of innovation there, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I always say to people, you know, when we're standing around in hipster coffee bars and people just put their lid on, I say, hey, try sipping it, then try sipping it with the lid off. Any different? And they say, oh, wow, it's completely different. That's right. Because, you know, those lids designed to be convenient are protecting you from having the most important component for your enjoyment of that coffee, all the aromas and the odors going to the nose. So yes, there's a need for innovation. It needs to be transported safely, but you know, my goodness, do we want to have the aromas of coffee as well?
And you mentioned something really interesting there when we were talking about the cheese. And I think this is something that we're constantly taking into consideration when we're designing dishes for the chef's table, which is this idea of context. And for me, I found that you mentioned it in regards to you could smell a certain aroma. Maybe it smells of teenage boys' stinky sock, in which case it's horrible. But if you're exposed to it under the context of it being fine cheese, then that all of a sudden becomes much more pleasant. Do we have similar kind of, because I correct me if I'm wrong here, but I would say what I found anecdotally over the years is that when it comes to texture, context seems to be extremely important to people. So when you, what I've encountered at least is when people are thinking about the gristly, let's say fat on meat, most people will say, oh, I don't like the flavor. But actually it's the fat that gives flavor to the meat. So they do enjoy that. Well, then they'll say, oh, well, it's actually the texture. If you give them little gummy bear sweets or whatever it may be, they like chewy, soft kind of textures. So what is it about context that's so important to our enjoyment among all the senses?
Well, I think context is terribly important, internal and external. So there's the internal context of how you personally are constituted and will react to texture in particular. And then there's the context of acceptability. What are the clues given to you by shape or color, or even just a label and a description that make what you're eating acceptable? As you said, if you give people isovaleric acid and ethyl butyrate to smell together, if you tell them it's Parmesan cheese, it'll be delicious. If you don't tell them that and tell them it's a nasty smell, they'll think it smells of vomit. So we can flip people's hedonic acceptance of what they're smelling by having the right label. That shows labels are terribly important. This is something that Heston Blumenthal found out when he was giving people crab ice cream. They didn't want to eat it because, the idea of crab ice cream, that's wrong. My category is that ice cream should be sweet. It should be, easy. Fish doesn't belong in that category. Mm-hmm. But when you call it frozen savory bisque, people say, oh, this is delicious. So the very same dish can be changed for you just by changing the label. That's a part of external context. But
so
I also
everything down to, I was going to say everything down to even how you write the menu, how you word the dishes. We're saying that all of this is building, again, that constructing expectations and judgments about what it is that you're going to consume. And then I guess that relates to how congruent and how in context things are.
Yeah, and notice how important descriptions are. When you said, if you have a piece of gristle of fat, people think of it sliding around the mouth and it being very unpleasant. But if you say, gummy bear, chewy, even if it was savory, you'd think, fine. So, gum is fine, gristle is not. Exactly how we're using those predictions of what to expect. But talking about texture, I've begun to think that texture is so important. It's one of the hidden drivers of food acceptability. I mean, if you think of it, this is something that the gastrophysicist Ollie Muritzen has said. Almost every complaint in a restaurant is about the sense of touch. The steak was too tough. The eggs were too runny. The coffee was too cold. The wine was too warm. Think about how temperature, texture, these are things that drive whether we'll have the same product in one condition or another. And Ollie Muritzen also did a wonderful experiment where he takes a cucumber and purifies it, and then with some gum, he makes it into a jelly. And if you use xanthan gum, you can have something pretty flavorless and jellified. And I've tried this too. If blindfold you give people some of this jelly to try, they will say, oh, I don't know what that is. Oh, I'm not sure. It's familiar. I don't know if I like it. And then if you give them a little piece of cucumber and they crunch on it, they say, cucumber. Now, only 8% of the population can tell when it's in a state of jelly that they're tasting cucumber. So it shows you that whether you'll accept a food is whether it has the right texture. And also, I found that eggs are one of those real dividers. If your scrambled eggs are too runny or too firm, it really divides people.
Yeah.
So texture is terribly important for food identification and food acceptability.
You talked a little bit earlier, because what kind of talking about what we like, what we don't like. A lot of this comes down to, I guess, personal preference, right? A lot of it will be there. When we're talking about living in separate taste worlds, is that why you have phenomenon like certain people feeling, and I am one of these people that when they eat coriander feel it's quite soapy, and other people actually really, really enjoy however it is that they perceive the flavor of coriander. So how, as a chef, do I reconcile this and try and put out a menu that tries to, because as I said, again, we're going into this age of personalization more and more, where we, both on dietary requirements, but as well on flavor and taste. And how as a chef, then, can I bring all these elements together in a meaningful way, or is there no way of doing that? Or what are your thoughts?
I think there are many things to say about that. The coriander separation, cilantro or coriander, is it divides populations. I'm with you. It tastes soapy and metallic, and other people can have handfuls of it, which I really don't understand, and they say delicious. Now that's to do with a genetic difference. You've got the allele that we have, and then we will say soapy. Now the funny thing is, although it's soapy, and I don't particularly like it on its own, some combinations, that soapy metallic taste actually works. If you've got a very good piece of sushi quality tuna and some lime juice across it and a little bit of coriander, I can let that flavor in there, and I
agree with that.
Yeah. So it's very funny how we can move our likes and dislikes, but I think that's because, and this is where we maybe disagree a little. You mentioned flavor is a construct of the mind or the brain, and I want to say flavor perception is a construct of the mind or the brain, but what we're perceiving, the flavors, I think are out there. So I think there are better and worse perceptions. So if we're not in a good condition to taste, we'll miss some of the flavors. And if we're good tasters and we've had lots of practice, we'll be able to detect what's there. And that's separate from liking, which is subjective, because you and I could try many dishes. We could agree on how well they were made and what ingredients they had, and that these were very well combined, but you might like them and I might not like them. So I think that there's an obligation to try and get our perceptions, which the brain creates, to get better and better at discerning what's in the food and in the dish and in the wine. But it's there to be detected. And although we may start from different places, just as we may have different eyesight, how far away something looks may be different to you and to me, but there's a distance it is. And then we have to learn to work around that.
As you were talking there, it kind of got me thinking about this idea of how with things like sound and color, you have scales and tones and different ranges, right? But when it comes to the chemical senses, we don't really have that, do we? We don't think of that in ranges. We don't think of saltiness or sourness as being a range. We think it's either an ingredient is salty or it isn't salty, or it is sour or it isn't sour. Do we perceive different types of saltiness or different types of sourness or sweetness in different ways? You'd mentioned this a little bit about the sugar, the difference between sucrose and aspartame.
Yes.
But does that carry through with the other tastes?
I think it maybe does, but you're absolutely right that the scales are different. Instead of having these wonderful sort of rising scales in music, and instead of having colors where there's a spectrum of going from one to the other, with sour and salty and so on, we tend to have not much, got it, too much. So there's a tipping point, and then that's around our threshold for detection.
And that'll be individual to each person, right?
That's very individual. The threshold to be individual to each person. And the thing to notice is that people who are the opposite of super tasters, the so-called non-tasters, it just means not discriminating tasters, but people who get very little sensitivity and whose taste buds are very stretched out, including Linda Bartoshuk, who came up with the term. Linda is a sort of non-taster who can have 5 or 6 sugars in her tea. Now, we've all seen that. We've seen people who just go on spooning in, and you think, how could you bear it? But the answer is they need to get to a very high level to have anything, and anything over that, it just stays pretty much the same. Similarly, we think once a dish is salty, it doesn't become twice as salty, it's just salty. But when you were asking about, do we have differences in sugar? Yes, aspartame and sucrose tasted quite differently because of the timings. But smell makes a difference here too. The medieval historians of food, and I'm thinking in particular of Christopher Woolgar, who wonderful food historian, and he said the medieval recipe makers thought we had 8 basic tastes. So we had salty and salty like the sea. And they
Oh,
were
interesting.
different. Yes. And actually, I think what's interesting about
I
that,
can understand that difference.
yes, yes. And I think the difference may come down to potassium chloride versus sodium chloride. That might be a difference. So the sea salt really is different. And then when you have, he also talked about them having sour and vinegary, and they were different.
That again, that makes sense. I mean, I can see why you would differentiate between the type of acidity and the way it works on the palate of, let's say, balsamic or cider vinegar versus limes and lemons. Yeah.
Yes. So we always think that we're very new and very sophisticated, but a little bit of history brings out something beautiful there, which you immediately get. I mean, as soon as you say to people, salty and salty like the sea, they say, yes, yes, I can do that. I can imagine that. Wonderful.
And again, so I want to loop back to something I'd asked a moment ago, is how as a chef then do I reconcile all this and bring it together to develop menus that people are going to enjoy in general, but taking all these elements into consideration?
Well, I think that there's a terrible trap, and chefs have to avoid it. And that this is a trap which I think sophisticated artists have already avoided, and you are culinary artists, so it's up to you too. And that is the idea that everything should be delightful and everything should be pleasurable and everything should just be easy. It doesn't have to be. I really love Chef Andoni's menus and cooking at Mugaritz. And he says, he puts on a tasting menu and he says, remember, not every dish has to be pleasurable. He wants people to struggle. He wants people to have contrast. He wants them to know there are some things like eating a bit of uncooked fish throat, which is chewy, difficult, a little bit sort of, its texture is a little slimy. But he wants you to realize we have this whole range of experiences as we eat. And only by contrast and only by seeing a menu as in effect, a performance and a set of experiences for comparison and reflection will you get the most out of them. That makes it art. And I think, I think you've got that. I think one or two chefs have got that. So don't always aim for the crowd pleasing dish.
Oh, I love that idea because so Andoni was actually quite, he was quite an inspiration for this particular idea that you're talking about now when it comes to my, let's say, willingness to go a little bit further with dining and see how far you can push certain limits. Now, he had said, I remember one quote of his is, he said, I went to culinary school and they taught me how to cook good food. Now I want to cook interesting food. And I thought that's a very telling kind of quote. And what it's done for us over time is I've found that we've become more and more interested in this whole idea of emotional engagement of our guests at the table and tapping into different emotions. And obviously you want fun and enjoyment and people laughter and nostalgia and these positive emotions. But it did also get us thinking about emotions like fear and disgust. Fear, there being lots of foods that we as humans have a fear of. And that can be from culture.
Insects.
Yeah. Insects, jellyfish, these are kind of foods that you'll find kind of in many parts of the world, people have an aversion to them. I'm looking at how you can make these states, let's call them, a part of a dining experience. You don't want to alienate people, but it is about challenging them in some way and getting them to think a little bit differently about food.
I think that's right. And that's the thing. People who are interested in what they're eating will thank you for, because we want interesting experiences. We're very lucky. We have lived in a time where we can have huge number of ingredients. We have dishes from all over the world. We're very choosy eaters. We've got tremendous choice. But interest is one of those things that challenges us. Voltaire said, taste invites reflection. And I think that's right. You want to eat something and then think a little more about it. And so the more a chef can provoke you, invite that reflection, the more interesting the food is. And the Andoni's quote about moving from making good food to interesting food reminds me of a quote that Hugh Johnson, the wine critic, always says. He's not sure where he got it from, but it's such a beautiful quote, which is, I'd rather have a lesser wine if it had more to say. That's good. I mean, I think that's good because nowadays you can have these beautiful wines. They're impeccable. They're very crafted. They're very polished. But in some sense, it's all too samey and easy. Whereas if you have something a little more angular, a little more challenging, the brain starts working. I think that's also why chefs know to add texture. Every chef says, I put this in for texture. And people say, what do you mean? Well, you say, well, it adds interest. If you've got a lot of soft foods and then you've got some crunch or bite, or you've got different textures there, the brain notices contrast. And if anything, our chemical senses are there to detect when things have changed. Your sense of smell is acutely targeted on, has something gone wrong? Is there a smell of smoke? Is there a predator? Is this food off? Is it okay? Is something being cooked and I want to go and find out? So our sense of smell is a sensor for something changing in the environment. And the more you can introduce these contrasts and changes into dishes, the more interested the brain is and the diner is.
And well, focusing on wine for a moment, I know this is an area of great personal kind of interest and passion around this, as well as having the kind of academic and philosophical, let's say, approach to appreciating wine. You've worked quite a bit on glassware. What would you say some of the kind of main findings, or what are some of the kind of key points of interest when it comes to, because as you said, you can have beautiful wines, and I guess the type of glass you have it in must have a bearing on how you appreciate it.
Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing worse than somebody opening a good bottle and then presenting it to you in a glass, which is like this. It's flared at the top. I mean, you have to have a glass whose aperture is narrower than the bowl so that you concentrate the aromas to go to your nose, because the aromas of a beautiful handmade intoxicating wine are going to be the most beguiling thing. But also the thickness of the glass. There's something very interesting. And I think all of us in our non-expert way know that there's a cup or a mug that we like to drink tea or coffee from, and it's often to do with the thickness of the rim and the lip. You can change the experience by having a huge, thick mug with a very thick lip. You somehow feel you're not getting the same experience. The shape of the wine glass will also deliver the wine to different parts of the palate. So that means that people have tried experimenting famously, Riddell and others, with glasses with particular shapes for particular grape varieties, wines that will deliver different things to the palate. You want something that spreads out, or something that's root one, or something that has more volume. Now, these are very difficult to examine scientifically, as our friend and colleague Charles Spence knows, because if you really wanted to do a proper scientific study where you had controlled experiments, you would need not you to be lifting the glass, you would need the glass to be lifted to your mouth and delivered at the rate that was right for you. But of course, if you do this mechanically, you all know how difficult it is if someone's trying to feed you with a glass. It's too much, too little. So if you're holding the glass, that may make a difference. The weight of the glass, the feel of the glass in your hand, and of course there are glasses now that are so slender and thin, the idea is nothing comes between you and the wine. There isn't supposed to be anything intrusive. So I do think that there's a certain amount of scientific fact behind this to do with the rate of delivery to the mouth, the amount of aroma that's released, how we feel about the weight of the implements that we're lifting. But then there'll still be that measure of individual preference and choice, which will be partly to do with you and your physiology and your experience.
And we've talked about dining experiences, working with chefs. We've talked about wine. To give people at home, though, a bit of an understanding of why is the study of the senses important? What's the bigger picture of this? So aside from designing weird, wonderful, crazy dining experiences, aside from a greater appreciation of wine, what is all this kind of research, would you say, is leading towards? Or what can it help us achieve in the future?
So I think that we are very unaware of how the experiences that we have put us in touch with the environments that we're in, allow us to move and act fluently in those environments, allow us to detect quickly and effortlessly things that are dangers or things that might be attractions. And by understanding how our senses work, we understand how both to design better environments for ourselves, ways in which things could be changed in the environment to suit creatures like us. For example, car design, street and city design for people whose eyesight is fading, or people with disabilities. How can we, when we know how they take in and use the information around them, we can craft the ways they will interact with their environment and things built in the environment to make their experience and use of them better and more functionally appropriate.
Right.
And I also think that there are things about the senses that we're still finding out that just amaze us. As you say, I'm very interested in our sense of smell. Realizing that one of the major points of attraction between ourselves and our mate is the sense of smell. We often choose people because their smell indicates that their immune system is further away from ours, and that makes us evolutionarily fit to mate. Yes. So the human leukocyte activity, when you've got the HLA of humans, what will give you the smell that you carry is bacteria on your skin, what you eat, and your immune system. Now, when we smell other people, we seem to be unconsciously responding to how far or close their immune system is to us. And I think we've all noticed that. There are people you could say, very attractive, I like them, they're extremely nice, but if they just don't smell right, they don't smell bad, but it just doesn't smell right, it's no good. There's nothing that will get us over that. On the other hand, we can meet people in the day and say, they were wonderful, I was so captivated. And you don't know why. Well, instead of love at first sight, it might be love at first smell. So just learning these things can give you an understanding of what kind of animals we are and how we navigate our environment. So I'm interested in all of the ways in which the senses will put us in touch with the world. Let me say one more thing. As we become more and more dominated by the rise of the digital world, we've got so much data that is streaming at us. Now, the question is, how can we consume and use that data in a fast and fluid way? And I think, as we used to worry about human-computer interaction, we should now worry about human-data interaction. Is there a way of interacting with data that isn't just reading something or looking? Are there ways in which we can sonify information? One of the most beautiful uses of that is the idea of being in a ICU, where usually you're hearing, the beep, beep, beep of the heartbeat monitors and the oxygen monitors. And of course, if the patient's awake, it might be alarming to hear, those sounds suddenly go off. But if you have a set of harmonies that might rise or fall, and that people can respond to them, if they're clinicians, without it interfering what they're doing and concentrating on, they could take in that information more fluently and smoothly. And equally, there might be ways in which we consume data by smell or by touch or by taste in future. So I think this is a promising area.
Two things kind of came to me at that point. I was thinking, as a chef, I guess when I look at this research, I obviously look at it from a very kind of chefy perspective. And I guess I found that the applications for me in terms of, or the potential applications within designing, because you mentioned it there, designing better food experiences. And I think in care homes, in hospitals, in schools, I think there's so much of that that's needed there. One kind of very quick anecdote I have is about going to a school to do a little bit of research there, and they'd invited us to go in and see the kids in their natural environment in the dining hall. Now, this dining hall, like many others around the country, has a double purpose. It's the gym and the dining hall. So you go in there and it smells of fried food and feet, and very high ceilings, so really strong kind of sound level there. And they were even telling us that some children had to be removed from that space or didn't eat in that communal area because it was just too overstimulating for them.
Yes.
And do you think there is that potential there to kind of improve dining in areas outside of restaurants?
Absolutely. I mean, I can think of several. That's a very good story because it just tells you what's wrong. And I think of us as children going into school canteens and smelling the leftover juices of boiled cabbage and just being immediately off-putting. So, beware and be careful with your environment. It makes a huge difference to your eating experience. Care homes, we've suddenly taken an interest in care homes, and I hope that will continue. We must think about how to give people better experiences of eating when we know their sense of smell is now diminishing. And we must think of using more interesting ways to make food.
And is that because smell diminishes with age? Like why?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, our eyesight will fade, our ears will fade, but we will use glasses and we'll have hearing aids. There's nothing to replace the loss of smell when it diminishes. So by the age of 70, about a quarter of the population in this country will be functionally nosmic. They will have no sense of smell. And you often hear older people say, this doesn't taste as good as it used to. And what they mean is they can't really get the flavor of it because the sense of smell is not there. So how do we make those dishes interesting, enjoyable, appealing? I think that's something to work on, as well as the environment, the plates that you're eating off, the cutlery. If your hands are arthritic, you don't want the same feel of something in your hands that you might have used when you were younger. And then, of course, the other area, if it ever comes back, is flying. There's a lot of thought has gone into how to make a better experience of eating and drinking in the air, because we know it's a terrible environment. It's cold, it's noisy. The noise will interfere with your ability to taste things. You're getting
expand. Tell us a little about that. How will noise?
Yeah, well, this
affect what I'm tasting?
Well, this is I think hugely interesting. It turns out that when you have white noise in your ears of about 39 decibels or above, that diminishes the brain's ability to pick up salt, sweet, and sour from the tongue by about 10 to 15%. So this is a reason why you've got white noise in your ears from 79 decibels or 89 decibels will be the noise of a commercial aircraft cabin. And of course, in business class, especially companies like Lufthansa, they'll give you Bose noise cancelling headphones. It'll make the food taste much better, and they've realised that. So we knew that this was having an effect, but we wondered whether it was all foods. And it turns out that the fifth taste, umami, as you know, the taste in soy sauce and mushrooms and Parmesan cheese and tomatoes, that is immune to this effect of noise on perception of taste. And then Charles Spence and I thought, well, maybe that's why everybody drinks tomato juice and Bloody Marys on planes. A lot of people will have a Bloody Mary on an aircraft, but they won't have it at any other time. And you say, why do you have it? They say, I don't know. It's appealing. It's savory. It tastes better. So have things with lots of umami if you're eating on a flight and you haven't got your noise cancelling headphones, and you'll have a better tasting experience.
That's incredible. So smell has come up again and again. There's one thing I want to kind of ask you, because I came up against this small bit of research. They had done it on a small sample size. But essentially what they found from their research, this was about looking at the importance of sense of smell, is they found that in long-term research, those who had lost their sense of smell suffered from, let's say, a greater degree of depression than those who lost their sense of vision.
Yes.
Now, again, I'm not 100% sure of the accuracy of this research, but it did make sense in terms of what you were talking about earlier about people depending on their sense of smell for mating, if we depend on it for our appreciation of flavor and taste in food. And I guess you can have, if you lose your sense of smell, do you also lose your appetite? And does that? Yes.
I mean, it's terribly important. That research is very reliable. So we know when people lose their sense of smell that the olfactory bulb shrinks. And shrinkage in the olfactory bulb is now a biomarker of depression. people who are depressed actually have much less volume in the olfactory bulb. So the olfactory bulb is linked by just two relays to the amygdala, which is an excitable area of the brain, which is very connected with emotion and some emotional memory. And the idea is information flows in both directions, but if you're not feeding the amygdala, probably you're dampening down your arousal and responsiveness. So it can make you depressed. But as you say, think of how many things smell is involved in. It's involved in the familiarity of your family and friends. It's involved
because you go to someone's home and it smells of their home.
Smells of their home, and you say so. The places you go, you walk into, they're reassuring and familiar. Equally, as you say, a lot of people who suffered recently with coronavirus through loss of smell, sudden loss of smell, they often reported loss of appetite. And that was a clue. They didn't want to eat. Food didn't interest them. They were finding it unappetizing, but that was because smell wasn't making a contribution to food. And equally, as we talked about, in the elderly, when people lose their appetite, there's a real problem with geriatric anorexia, where we can't get older people to eat enough. So, and I think the sense of smell also is interesting. Although you said we go into people's homes and we know the smell, our own home doesn't seem to have a smell, which is odd because everyone else's home's got a smell, and that's because we've got used to it. We've habituated, so we've forgotten to pay attention to it. And in fact, if it doesn't change, we don't pay attention to it unless we've been away for 2 or 3 weeks. And we come back and we think, oh, that's how it smells. But people who lose their sense of smell talk about feeling alienated from their own home, and they often say, I feel as though I'm behind glass, which is a very striking metaphor of how much smell connects you to your surroundings. And we didn't know it did. It's the loss of it that tells us it was really quite important.
Have you seen a great example, like, just because you must be so aware of this, and just wondering, have you ever seen a great example of smell being used in hospitality or dining or restaurants that has remained memorable for you, or that you would say is a really unique use of it? Or
well, I'm going to make you blush because I think you had a really good use of it, and it was for two things. We had an earth dish where you sprayed the restaurant with the smell of geosmin. Now, geosmin is the smell you get of forest floor, the sort of mushy leaves on a forest floor. Sometimes after rain, you can smell that too. I actually brought a little jar of geosmin back from my lab, thinking if we were locked in, I wanted to be able to smell the smell of the forest.
Oh, right. So, to transport yourself to the outdoors.
Yes, you can. So you provided this with a dish with earthy flavors, and I thought it worked terribly well. You also did another experiment, which has stayed with me, where you sprayed the air with the smell of bacon, and then we were invited to have squares of chocolate that were either milk chocolate or dark chocolate. And then you sprayed the air with, I think, passion fruit. And then you said, okay, choose.
Great memory.
Yeah. And then you said it was a great experiment. And then you said, choose milk chocolate or dark chocolate. Now, before we tell everyone, I'd invite them just to think, what would I have with the smell of bacon, milk or dark chocolate? What would I have with the smell of passion fruit, dark or milk chocolate? And I think it's easy. Milk chocolate with the bacon, dark chocolate with the passion fruit. And somehow that works so well. It's congruent. It's sensory congruence. It's the right combination. So I thought that was absolutely brilliant. And I'm sure I'm going to quote you on it many times.
Oh, thank you. Look, one thing that I've got to, because I don't want to keep you for much longer, but one thing I've really got to discuss with you, because I'm so genuinely interested in your take on this. All restaurants, including our Chef's Table and hospitality businesses, are looking for what the new normal is going to look like, how we're going to kind of move forward after the lockdown, and what restaurant experiences are going to be like. Now, given, I guess, some of the kind of restrictions that will be in place, I don't know, I'm not asking a direct question as much as what do we envision perhaps the future of restaurants is going to look like? Would it be okay if we're masked and gloved? Do we want our waiters and chefs in an open kitchen masked and gloved? maybe what are the other sensory kind of elements or parts of the journey that we can elevate in some way to kind of create that same kind of great dining experience, but be sympathetic to the fact that we've got to keep our staff and guests safe?
I think that's a great question, and it worries me because the hospitality industry is very dependent on just that, hospitality. The engagement with the diner as they walk through the door, the front of house staff are so important. The rapport, the connection, the attentiveness, the way in which really good dining staff read the needs and interests and the differences of their customers and respond to them. And I think good dining staff are a joy to behold. It is like a theatrical performance. It's something which I'm immensely pleased with and appreciative and grateful for. So what happens if somebody approaches you in a visor or with gloves? I think the full-faced visor is not so bad because, if they're masked, you don't get as much facial recognition. But if you get the whole face behind a visor, I think that's going to help a lot. I think what we realize is that it will be taking away something that was becoming increasingly important to restaurants. Restaurants and chefs were beginning to notice how important it was to feel near to their customers. Restaurants that had an open kitchen where diners could see the chefs and the kitchen team, the kitchen brigade working and appreciate all the concentration and effort, and the way chefs and the kitchen team could look up occasionally and see the pleasure and the response that their diners would give. That united them. That gave them a close connection. And I think both parties felt better for it. That was an incredibly important thing.
Well, actually, I saw a bit of research from Cornell that said that chefs in open kitchens supposedly put out better food and are happier in the kitchen.
I think they are, because they feel closer to the product and the consummation and response to their work and their labor. And people like to see that silent sort of no theater of the busy kitchen brigade, all sort of chopping and working in terribly tight spaces. I mean, it's beautiful to behold. So now, are we going to see that? Probably. I think we can have the barriers, we can have the glass, we can have the protection we need, but important to maintain visual contact, to feel the closeness, to feel in touch. But I think we may have to reinterpret the restaurant a little bit like space research, when we look at how people in bubbles and in large gloves and masks are actually able to consume and still enjoy food. So maybe we have to look at what goes on the space station if we're going to learn any lessons.
Well, and there's exciting things going on up there in space.
Yes.
Barry, I won't keep you any longer because I appreciate your time so much. Thank you for taking the time. If people want to find out more about your work and more about this kind of research, where would they head to?
If you look at my page on the University of London School of Advanced Study website, you will find me, Professor Barry Smith. And also, you often get a lot of information that I will point your way on Twitter, and that's @SmithBarryC.
Oh, yeah, you're very active on Twitter and you share great resources on there. So I do direct everyone who's interested in this to follow.
Thank you. And thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. It's been a huge pleasure and an honor to be invited on.
No, it's my pleasure, and keep safe. And I hope you have a wonderful, going into the weekend soon.
Thank you. Keep safe, everyone. Bye.
Bye.